Bear in the movie is, for lack of a better word, hot AF. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. For those of you who don't know, my name is Faith, and thank you so much for watching. Today is episode 4 in my series where I compare books to their film or TV show adaptation, and we are doing, drumroll please, Little Women. I love Little Women. I literally played Beth March in my college's production of Little Women a few years ago, and I loved it so much. Did I just read the book for the first time less than a month ago? Maybe, but I still love Little Women. We are comparing it to Greta Gerwig's 2019 adaptation. So this is your warning, there will be spoilers for the book and pretty much every film or TV show adaptation of Little Women. Something that I need to bring up before we get into it is that the Little Women that most of you know and love, I'm assuming you love it if you're watching this video, is that Little Women is actually 2 separate books called Little Women and Good Wives. Little Women takes place when they are children, and then Good Wives takes place a few years after that. Even though I just read the book for the first time, overconsumption core, I do have 4 copies. This is the only copy I have where it is solely Little Women and not both Little Women and Good Wives. Most copies are sold as both Little Women and Good Wives, but they're just called Little Women. For example, in this copy, it is just called Part Second. And in this copy, it is just called Part Second. And then in this copy, there is no distinction between Part 1 and Part 2. It pretty much just continues as is. However, it does still have the final little paragraph from Little Women, which says, "So grouped, the curtain falls upon Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy. Whether it ever rises again depends upon the reception given to the first act of the domestic drama called Little Women," which in today's terms means like for Part 2. So the majority of film and TV show adaptations of Little Women is both Little Women and Good Wives. It's just called Little Women. To make it easier, I'm not really going to differentiate the two unless I specifically say this happens in Good Wives. Whenever I refer to Little Women, I'm talking about Little Women and Good Wives. Now that that is out of the way, there is just one more disclaimer that I would like to add before we get into it. Pretty much every video in this series so far has been pretty different with what I focus on for each adaptation. For example, in the last episode where I covered Alice in Wonderland, I pretty much was able to walk through step by step of the differences of the plot. However, Little Women is over 500 pages long and the movie is over 2 hours long, so I simply cannot do that for this video. And in my personal opinion, most of the scenes that are in the movie are also in the book. In the book, those scenes are just longer, and some scenes in the book don't make it to the movie, but I feel like the movie doesn't add that much that wasn't in the book. Again, that is just my opinion. You can totally disagree if you want. So while I will touch on a few plot points, most of what I'm going to be focusing on is the differences between the characters from the book to the movie. Like my other videos in the series, I'm going to be focusing more on the differences than the similarities. And in this video, I've come up with 17 major ones because again, I do not have time to talk about all of them, and over half of those are about characterization. Everything I present as a fact about the book or the movie, to my understanding, is true. If I'm wrong, please correct me in the comments. For example, if I said Jo died in the book, obviously that's not true, so feel free to correct me for things like that. Now that all that's out of the way, let's dive into Little Women. So first, we have the most obvious difference, which is that in the movie, it is not told in chronological order. In the movie, the story is told past, future, past, future, past, future, past, future, but in the book, it is told chronologically, so you have the entirety of Little Women, which is them being children, and then the entirety of Good Wives, which is them a few years after Little Women takes place. The first time watching the movie, that can be really confusing, at least it was for me, and I think this is an unpopular opinion, but I actually do like the non-linear storytelling of the movie. However, I do still prefer the book. It's just not something that I don't like about the movie. The movie is mainly told through Jo's perspective. Obviously not all of it, because there are scenes that she's not in, so we can't get those parts through Jo's perspective. However, when Jo is present on screen, she's almost always the main character in the scene, so everything we see about the other characters are pretty much through her perspective. In the book, Jo is definitely still the main character, but I feel like you do get a lot more moments where she's not present, and in the moments that she is present, usually she still is the main character in the scene. However, I feel like the way the other characters are presented in those scenes are less through her rose-tinted glasses and more of just what everybody would be saying, if that makes sense. So it's more their actual character and not just Jo's opinions of how that character is. And that's definitely more of just an opinion, but I do feel like in the movie, we do see the characters more through her eyes than we do in the book. Something that I was actually very surprised about when I was reading the book is how much dialogue from the book makes it into the movie. A lot of it you might not notice because, of course, in a book, you can't have multiple characters speaking at once. You'll read it line by line by line. However, in the movie, everyone can talk over everybody, and I feel like when you have the sisters all together, that's a lot of what was happening, specifically when it was the younger versions of them. For example, in the book, it would read like, Meg said hello, Jo said hello, Beth said hello, Amy said hello, but then in the movie, you would have them all saying hello at the same time. So I do feel like in moments like that, it's not obvious that the dialogue is taken out of the book, but it definitely does happen. And I feel like one of the main scenes where the dialogue is the same is the scene where Laurie confesses his love to Jo, and that might just be because that is the main part of the movie that I have memorized. Like, what hardcore Little Women fan doesn't know we gotta have it out, Joe. So the second that was said in the book, I was like, oh my god, locking in, this is pretty much the same thing. Of course, that scene isn't word for word, and I do feel like the ending of that scene is pretty different in both the book and the movie. It is fairly similar. This is my 4th episode in the series, and I probably would say that of the 4 books I've compared so far, Little Women's dialogue is most accurate from book to film. Which isn't saying much because, again, I've only done 4 books, but it's saying something. Like I briefly touched on at the very beginning of this video, when you combine Little Women and Good Wives, it comes out to over 500 pages. And even though the movie is over 2 hours long, in no world can you make a 500-page book word for word, scene for scene, a 2-hour movie. So of course, there are things you have to cut. Like I said earlier, I feel like that for the most part, it's not that the movie changed scenes, it's that they cut a lot of scenes out and then shortened the scenes that they did keep in. So in doing so, a lot of the character interactions had to be cut. For example, in the book, there are way more scenes of all of the girls bickering and getting into fights with each other than there are in the movie. Because those scenes are longer in the book and you get scenes in the book that you don't get in the movie, there is a lot more character development in the book than there is in the movie. So this is really where we dive into the differences between the characters in the book and the movie. And I'm going to mainly focus on the 4 sisters, but I will briefly touch on the other characters. So before we get into the sisters, let's touch on those other characters first. First, we have the Lawrences, and I'm just going to talk about Mr. Lawrence and Laurie at the same time. In the book, it appears that the Lawrences are much closer to the Marches than they are in the movie. Of course, in the movie, you do still get the friendship between the two, but again, because of all those scenes that they have to cut or shorten, you do get significantly more of it in the book. In both the book and the movie, you do get the scene of Mr. Lawrence gifting Beth the piano, and in my opinion, in the movie, that is one of the main interactions that you get between the Lawrences and the Marches, and in the book, yes, it's still one of the more main ones, but it's not like the main interaction that everyone thinks about. At least, I don't think that's one of the main things people think about. That being said, because I was Beth, that is one of the main scenes that I do think about. Me having to play the piano in front of the entire audience every single show we did, and one of them, I did mess up, but that's showbiz, baby. Again, I do just feel the relationship is more fleshed out in the book than it is the movie, and that's not to say it's non-existent in the movie. It definitely is still there. I just feel like it's deeper in the book. And then we have Aunt March. And in the movie, Aunt March is played by Meryl Streep, so obviously they're going to use that to their advantage and put her in the movie a lot. In the book, she's a pretty present character. She has multiple scenes. However, in the book, whenever we hear about March, that's what we're doing. We're hearing about her. It's not like she's actively on the page joining in on the conversation. It's more so, oh, Aunt March told me this. Aunt March did this. But in the movie, it's Aunt March, we're looking at you saying this right now. Obviously, she does appear on page in Little Women. However, you just more so hear of her from like word of mouth rather than actually hearing from her. And if I was ever to make a book to film adaptation and Meryl Streep was there, I would also make that character more present so I can use Meryl Streep. And then we have Marmee, and honestly, I don't think she's that different from the book to the movie. However, in the movie, we do get that scene where she's talking to Joe and expresses that she does get angry quite often. In the book, she's definitely presented as a very saintly woman, very calm, not quick to anger at all. And of course, that's not to say that in the movie she's always aggressive and mean and angry. However, she does just have that moment where she's like, I do get angry sometimes, and that's just not in the book at all. The book definitely presents as that is not something that she would ever feel. And I actually do really like that addition in the movies. This is one of the few characters that I do feel like we go a little bit deeper into in the movie compared to the book. And now we're gonna move into the March sisters, going from oldest to youngest. We're starting with Meg. Meg, in my opinion, was very sidelined in the movie. I forget exactly what they called it, but that whole scene of her going to the ball, in the book, if I remember correctly, it was like a week-long thing, but in the movie, it was literally just one day. When Lauren catches her in that scene in the movie, yeah, she does get embarrassed, but she's also pretty defensive because he's like, girl, what are you doing? And she's like, I just want one night where I can feel like I'm at the top of society. And he's kind of like, I don't agree, but do what you gotta do, right? And so I feel like in the movie, it's her being a lot more defensive about it than embarrassed. Even though we definitely get the embarrassment, it's just less present than the defensiveness. In the book, we still get her being like, I'm gonna have a good time, but she has a little bit too good of a time and everyone like starts gossiping about it. So the embarrassment is much more present in the book version, in my opinion, than it is in the movie. Low key, I could be wrong about it being a week in the book and only a day in the movie, but either way, the embarrassment is a lot more present in the book than it is in the movie, in my opinion. And then we have the whole relationship between Meg and John. In the book, their entire relationship is a lot slower paced. In the book, they meet and get married pretty quickly, if I remember correctly. And again, that just comes with scenes being shortened or cut from the book. In the movie, we still get the scene of her buying the dress and then having to like try and hide it from John. But That is pretty short in the movie. In the book, that is quite a long chapter, and honestly, I really liked it in the book. That scene in the book is probably the most hashed out and the best look that you get into their relationship. And that scene being cut down so much in the movie, you just don't get that with their relationship. I definitely did prefer their relationship in the book compared to the movie. I actually can't remember if the scene was in the book or not, but I do love the scene where Meg is talking to Joe and she's like, just because my dreams are different than yours, it doesn't mean they're any less important. I cannot remember if that scene is in the book, but if it's not, I definitely really enjoyed the inclusion of it in the movie. So with Meg, really it's just that a lot of her scenes got shortened or taken out, so you don't get as much character development in the movie as you do in the book. And then we have Joe. Joe is literally the main character, so we definitely still get a ton of character development in both the book and in the movie. So honestly, of all the characters, I feel like her character is the most similar from book to movie. However, the main difference is that Greta Gerwig took moments from Louisa May Alcott's life and put those into Joe in the movie. That being said, to my understanding, Little Women is somewhat based around Louisa and her sister's life. However, that characterization for Joe is definitely more present in the movie than it is in the book. And I know I just said I was going to talk more about the girls' characterizations than the other characters. However, the other points that I want to talk about Joe fit better in other parts of this video. So while I will still touch on some differences with Joe, I will touch on that in a few minutes, and we're going to move on to Beth. Now, to my understanding, this is actually a very unpopular opinion, but I actually feel like Beth's character stayed very true to the book in the 2019 version. I would also probably go a step further than that and say her character in the 2019 movie is probably the closest to the book compared to the other adaptations of Little Women that I have seen. Other than my version of Beth, of course. Beth is extremely shy. She is extremely kind. She's extremely selfless. And I really feel like we get a very good feel for that in both the book and in the movie. In the second part of the book, aka Good Wives, it is very obvious that Beth is depressed. And I think that Eliza Scanlon, I think that's how you say her name, did an incredible job with that in the movie. I've seen so many people say that Beth in this movie is not accurate to the book at all that I was so surprised to find out just how accurate I feel that they are. Feel free to tell me if you agree with me in the comments, but I feel like thinking that this movie's version of Beth is accurate to the book version of Beth is a very unpopular opinion. While we're talking about Beth, we obviously need to speak about her death. Don't get me wrong, I cry at Beth's death every single time I watch this movie, but her death in the book is completely devastating, which honestly was kind of surprising because I feel like in the movie, it's not like, bam, she's dead, but it's a lot more sudden than it is in the book. Pretty much every scene with Beth in the second part of the book is her knowing that she's going to die soon. Of course, we have the scene in the movie with Beth and Joe at the beach, and that is so sad, but the book is like that scene times 10. And I'm pretty sure she does say this in the movie as well, but there's the whole part in the book where Beth is like, I've always felt like I would die sooner than you guys, or something like that. And that just broke my heart. Even though you can see her death coming from a million miles away in the book, it is just heart-wrenching. And again, that's not to say it's not in the movie, but I do feel like it's just way more gutting in the book than it is in the movie. Like in the book, she was just wasting away for months. I do still feel like you can see that in the movie, but it's just way more present, in my opinion, in the book. And then we have the baby of the family, Amy. In her younger years, in both the movie and the book, she's very bratty. I don't think anyone can really argue with that. I feel like it's how the book and the movie handle her later years that really sets them apart. She definitely does mature a lot in the book. However, I feel like that's seen from a distance. In the movie, I feel like you get a lot more up close with it. Literally one of the most iconic dialogues in the movie is when Amy is talking to Laurie and she's like, I'm not a poet, I'm just a woman. And thinking back, honestly, each of the girls get that defining moment for their character. For Meg, it's when she's telling Joe, just because my dreams are different than yours, it doesn't mean they're any less important. For Joe, it's when she's crying to Marvy and she's like, women have minds, they have souls. For Beth, it's the beach scene when she's telling Joe it's like the tide going out. And for Amy, it's that scene with Laurie where she's like, I'm not a poet, I'm just a woman. That monologue in the movie is just so deep. In that scene, Laurie's not exactly being like, this is who you are. He's more just being like, this is who I see that you are. And she's like, but that's really not who I am. I would say that that moment is the defining moment of Amy for her character, and I do just feel like that is missing from the book. To my understanding, before this version of the movie came out, everybody hated Amy, every single version of her, not just her as a kid, but her as an adult as well. And then this movie came out and a ton of people changed their opinions on her and they were like, I understand you. So while I do feel like most of the characters we get deeper with in the book, Amy is an exception, and I do actually feel like we get way deeper into her character in the movie. And the last character we're going to be talking about is Mr. Bear, and I only saved him for last so I could better transition out of the characters and back into the plot. Mr. Bear in the movie is, for lack of a better word, hot AF. In the book, he's very old and not hot AF. Don't get me wrong, in the movie, he is still very smart. He's still the genius that he is in the book. However, in the book, his real only defining characteristic, or not necessarily defining characteristic, but the trait that Jo loves most about him is that he is her intellectual equal. And again, yes, he is that way in the movie, and I would still say in the movie that is what she loves most about him. However, not to be mean, but like in the movie, he has a lot more going for him than he does in the book. In the movie, the relationship between Mr. Bear and Jo happens like right at the end. Personally, I do think he definitely had feelings for her pretty much the whole time he had screen time. However, she doesn't realize her feelings for him until literally the very end. In the book, it's not the sneak attack that it is in the movie. It's definitely gradual throughout the entire time his character is present. And in the book, I definitely think, even if it wasn't spoken out loud, that there were feelings between the two even before Laurie confessed his love for Jo. I understand why this change was made in the movie. Am I the biggest fan of that change? Honestly, not really, because again, it literally felt so abrupt. It felt so forced. That being said, that was the entire point of it. In the movie, Jo has a lot of on-screen interactions with her publisher. If I remember correctly, that never happens in the book. If it does, it's literally once or twice. Louisa May Alcott did not want Jo to end up with anybody, and the publishers were kind of pushing like, she needs to end up with Laurie. And I guess the compromise was, no, but if she has to end up with someone, she'll end up with this other guy who's actually would be her type. That is the real life story to my understanding. If I got that slightly wrong, I apologize. Feel free to correct me in the comments. So in the movie, it's meant to reflect, oh, she's not supposed to end up with somebody, to, oh, yes, she is. Without that backstory, I would not like that scene at all. However, with the backstory, I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm a fan of it. However, I do understand it better. I feel like it might have been better to meet somewhere in the middle and not having it just an abrupt ending, but maybe not spanning the entire time of their older years. In the movie, Jo literally writes Little Women. And that conversation with the publisher does happen in the movie, where he's telling Jo that in the book, Jo needs to end up with Laurie, and she's like, no. And that scene is interwoven with the scene of her finally realizing her feelings for Mr. Bear and then chasing him down at the train station. In the book, she doesn't publish Little Women. In the book, I'm pretty sure all of her storytelling was just her telling stories to the boys at her school. However, I do think it said that she did write some, again, just not to the same level that she did in the movie. Notice how I just said she's telling stories to the boys. In the book, Jo's dream is to open a school for forlorn boys and teach them at an all-boys school. In the movie, what happens is Aunt March dies and Jo inherits the mansion, and she turns that mansion into a school, but it's not just a school for boys, it is a school for literally everybody. And at that school, she employs pretty much her entire family. Both the book and the movie end with you getting to know that they have all had their own children at this point. Both the book and the movie end with pretty much everybody being happy. For the most part, all of their dreams came true. Of course, with the exception of those that died. And that is it. I do know that a lot of people hate the movie ending. Honestly, I don't really understand why, because I liked it, and I'm not really sure exactly which part they're referring to, whether it's the part with Mr. Bear or the part of the school. Honestly, I do prefer Bear and Jo's relationship in the book, so if that's what they're referring to, I can understand that, but if that's not what they're referring to, I don't really understand which part of the ending they don't really like. I know I talked mainly about characters and like barely about plot. If you would like a part 2 to this video where I solely talk about the plot and not really about the characters, I'd be more than happy to do that. Just leave a request in the comments. But that is Little Women. I do know that quite a bit of this with talking about characterization was opinions based, but I did my best to get the actual facts correct. Again, if I got literally anything wrong, please correct me in the comments. I will not be offended at all. I would like this to be as accurate as possible. If you liked this video, feel free to go check out the other videos I did in my series. So far I've done A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, Jurassic Park, and Alice in Wonderland. I do a new episode for this series on the last Sunday of each month. I don't have an adaptation picked out for next week. However, I do want it to probably be a horror or thriller just because it's going to be by Halloween. If you have one in mind that you would like me to do, feel free to leave it in the comments. And even if it's not a horror thriller, still feel free to leave it in the comments because even if I don't do it next month, I will at some point get to it. Next week will be my September reading wrap up, and if you've been following along with my physical TBR journey, I think he'll be very proud of me. And the week after that, I'm going to do a massive indie author / indie book shout out. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. And same with that, if you have indie authors or indie book recs that you want me to put in that video, feel free to drop them in the comments. However, I am using that video to shout out smaller authors and books, so I will be keeping it to that book has to have less than 2,000 reviews on Goodreads. But if you have a book or author that doesn't meet that qualification, but you still just want to leave a rec in the comments, feel free to do that. I think that is all that I have for you guys today. Be sure to like and subscribe and follow my Instagram in the description for more bookish content. I hope you all have a fantastic fall. Love you guys. Bye!